אני רוצה להזמין את הראשון מבין שני אורחים נכבדים מחול, שטרחו ובאו במיוחד עבור הכנס שלנו. מייסד, שותף ונשיא חברת אדיסון ריסרצ' מארצות הברית, אחת החברות המחקר הגדולות והחשובות והנחשבות בעולם ובארצות הברית במיוחד. מציג חובה בכל כנס שמכבד את עצמו, מיסטר לארי רוזין.
שלום, צהריים טובים. כמו הרבה יהודים אמריקאים, למדתי קצת עברית כשהייתי תלמיד צעיר. אבל עכשיו מיציתי את כל המילים בעברית שאני יודע, ולכן אדבר באנגלית. You seem to understand that. I'm very happy to be here today. My company was founded in 1994, and we've been studying trends in media throughout the entire period. We work with individual radio stations and radio companies throughout the globe. We're probably best known outside of radio. We're the company that performs the exit polls for the television networks on election nights, like tomorrow night, a bunch of primaries. And we will continue to do that through the big general election we have this November. It's kind of hard for me to believe that the big event when the world changed from 1999 to 2000 was only 12 years ago. And yet I'd kind of like to go back there to start my talk. Just 12 years ago in America, broadband internet access was in less than 10% of homes. Of course, there was no iPad, there were no Kindles, the iTunes music store didn't exist, there was no Xbox. There was a seldom used brand new search engine site called Google, but of course there was none of the other aspects, no Gmail, no Android, no search engine optimization. There was no Flickr for photographs. Wi-Fi was an experimental technology that could not be found in homes. There was no MySpace and nothing called social networking. There was no YouTube. In the dial-up era, watching video over the internet basically didn't work. There was no Wii, and of course, video games were nothing compared to what they are now. There was no new journalism, no recommendation sites like Dig or Huffington Post. Blogging didn't exist. That word hadn't even been invented by the year 2000. No LinkedIn for business people, no flat-screen televisions, no iPods, and of course, no iPhones, no Facebook, and there was no Pandora, which is the big internet radio service in the USA. Now, I don't mean to imply that there was nothing back in 2000. In America, we had this guy. This was the Pets.com sock puppet, which was the most egregious example of internet exuberance in 2000, one of the biggest failures of the first wave of the internet. The big thing I was researching in the year 2000 was Napster, if you remember Napster, the big way to steal music. And if you weren't using America Online to get online, you were probably using the Netscape Navigator in the year 2000. Blogging didn't exist yet, but you could get your own webpage on GeoCities. And if you wanted to listen to recorded music while you were at the gym or at the beach, you were probably using one of those, if you remember the Sony Discman. And as I said, my company has been tracking trends in media throughout this time. In particular, we perform a large annual tracking study in conjunction with the American radio ratings firm Arbitron. And I want to show you some of the changes in media from a statistical point of view. The data is embargoed, so I have the data from 2012, but I can't put it on the graphs because they'd get mad at me, but I'll tell you what the results are. So you'll know what the new results are from 2012. It's a giant survey of over 2,200 people nationwide. It's 12 plus, and we'll walk through that. But I do want to mention about radio in America right now, that while we're working in lots of countries, I want to talk about American radio. It's in a very particular situation. Commercial radio in the United States dates back to 1920, and it's been particularly challenging over the last decade. mostly because it's been severely limited in the options from a lack of free cash flow for investment and innovation. It's not because they don't have the cash. American radio stations are, by and large, incredibly profitable. But the troubles stem entirely from taking on enormous debt loads in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And this, the limitations on commercial radio has allowed competition to flow very rapidly from satellite radio, internet radio, and from our quasi-state broadcaster, National Public Radio. And the changes in the picture of radio has manifested itself in all kinds of interesting ways. There's been no drop really that's been recorded in the reach of radio and how many people listen to the radio. The changes have been mostly in terms of how much time people spend with over-the-air free broadcast radio. Here's one example. We've been tracking this. It didn't really change in 2012. We just asked self-reported how much time did you spend in the last 24 hours before you were called for our survey listening to the radio. And you see since 2000, the self-reported time dropped from 2 hours and 45 minutes to a little bit over 2 hours. That was consistent in this year's study. We've also been tracking this really interesting question where we say, think of sort of the big four media types, internet, television, radio, and newspapers. Which one, and in this case is among everybody 12 plus, are you using more lately? And we first asked the question in 2002, and look at the enormous change over the time. Internet going from third place to well into first place. Television only dropping a little bit. Where's the change been? Frankly, it's been a lot fewer people saying that they're using radio more lately, which sort of validates the other number. And we've asked this interesting question. Which of the four is the most essential to your life? And you see, again, that radio has gone from internet has gone from well behind to well ahead, largely at the expense of both radio and the newspaper, with television holding up a little bit more. Now, you have to be aware that it gets complicated when you talk about these things. Internet, well, people now listen to the radio through the internet. People watch television through the internet. So even the definitions of these things are sort of blurring and blending a little bit. But you see sort of the primacy of the idea of the internet anyway in people's minds. And then here's one of great relevance to radio in America. Which one do you turn to first to learn about new music? Radio, overwhelmingly high. I always say I want to meet the people who turn to the newspaper, for the handful of people who turn to the newspaper first to learn about new music. There's still a few in every one of these surveys. But you see that the internet is rapidly coming up. And if we just isolate 12 to 24-year-olds, you see that it's well past radio. I have a 19-year-old son, and he went off to college in Boston, and I said to him recently, have you listened to any radio since you've been there? And he said, no. I said, can you name any radio stations in Boston? And he said, no. And that kind of taught me a lot about what the situation was. So we've been tracking, going all the way back to the first study we did in this series 14 years ago. Have you ever listened to internet radio? And you see this, and this is just ever in your lifetime. You see the numbers have gone up and up. And in the 2012 study, it's now 60% of the U.S. population has ever listened to internet radio. This number is being held down by the fact that the number 65 plus, which is in our survey, are very, very small. So if you just take out, say, people over 55, the number is well into the high 70s, low 80s. And here we ask, have you listened to internet radio in the last week? And you see it's been this long struggle upwards since we first asked this question in 1999 to 22%. Well, I have this year's data, and the number took an enormous leap forward to 28%, the biggest one-year increase it's ever seen. So that's the number we'll be reporting. Also, among the people who say that they have listened to internet radio, they're telling us that they're listening to more of it than ever. This is in sort of hours, how many self-reported hours they spend listening to internet radio. Again, this is the base among anyone who does it. So the number of people doing it each year goes up. And in the 2011 study, it jumped to over 9 hours, and people self-reported a slightly bigger number as well this year. So again, over 9 hours. So if people are doing it a lot. And in America, the big game changer of internet radio is Pandora. And I don't know how familiar you are with it, but it's a very clever, easy-to-use music service which has really dominated the the market for internet radio. It's by most measures somewhere above 70% of all of internet radio, despite there being dozens and dozens of options. It's got a market share of over 70% of internet radio in the States. This is the percentage of people from last year who ever listened to Pandora, listened to the last month, and listened to the last week. And this, because Pandora is growing so rapidly, these numbers are wildly out of date. The numbers we'll report for this year are between 60 and 100% higher in each of these three categories for Pandora. So that's the kind of year-over-year growth that they are achieving. I know in the case of last week, it grew to 16% in terms of ever listening. It was, I think, something like 40% that we got in this year's study. So just growing at an incredibly rapid pace. Why is it growing? Well, we asked people, do you agree or disagree that this is a reason you listen to Pandora? This is agree strongly, because if I showed agree and agree strongly, it's like 100% for all of them. So I'm just showing these are strong reasons. And what Pandora is, it allows you to create your own radio stations based on your favorite songs or artists. One of their killer apps is the ability to skip songs. One of the least appreciated aspects of it is it's incredibly easy to use. People are able to use it almost instantaneously. It has way fewer commercials, as the previous speaker was talking about, and a variety of other reasons. But I'll also point out the last item. Do you agree that Pandora would be better if it had personalities or DJs who talked about the music? And virtually nobody agreed with that. It's just sort of a whole different format of radio from what people are getting over the air. And so it sort of exists in a slightly different space, but it's clearly having an impact on American radio. Another way that people have FM plus, if you will, in the United States is through satellite radio. We picked up in this study 11% of people, and this seems to jibe with their public data, say that they currently subscribe. This is really almost entirely having an impact on in-car radio listening, where most people are accessing this by putting a little tiny satellite radio receiver into their cars. But all these things come along to have an impact on the situation. Digital radio, known in America with the terrible name HD radio, is so small and underdeveloped that we're not even tracking it in our studies. So before someone asked about digital radio, I thought I'd mention that. It's a much bigger deal in the UK, and your speaker from the UK later perhaps can talk about digital radio. I was asked to speak about podcasting. We've been tracking podcasting since 2006. We first asked this long question where we describe podcasts and ask, have you ever heard of it? The numbers leveled off at 45%, and it was about the same again this year. We asked people, have you ever listened to an audio podcast? And the number is about level year over year. And again, the number will be about the same when we report the 2012 numbers. About a quarter of Americans say that they've ever listened to an audio podcast. And in the last month, about 12% said that they've listened to an audio podcast. So it's there. I mean, 1 in 8 people say they've listened in the last month to an audio podcast. The momentum behind, I would say, podcasting has really stopped in America at the moment. But maybe it's just a matter of great content, like the previous speaker was saying. Maybe if someone comes along with that super compelling podcast, it will change the game there. Here was one thing that I really wanted you to see, which is that we have a lot of people that we're picking up in our surveys who are listening to internet radio by taking their, what we would call cell phone or mobile phone, and hooking it into their car stereo and streaming the audio through their phone and through the car stereo system. It was 6% the first time we asked about it 2 years ago. It was 11% last year, and the number is about 17% of people. 17% of everybody in America has done this, has listened to internet radio into their car through their cell phone. So this is clearly becoming a serious force. And then there was a lot of interest when we set this up in the car. So this is from a different study we did, also with Arbitron, about what's going on in the car. These are all the different devices we could think of. Forget about the colors. It was used in our previous explanation of all this, but this is the percentage of people who say they ever use these devices in their primary car, if they have a car. And what the main point of this graph is, that it used to be hardly anything you could ask about, maybe like a radio and a cassette player not that long ago. And now just look how long the list of things we can ask about, of things that are trying to get into the car and at least compete for people's time while they're in their car, among all these kinds of different things. And so, yes, most of these items have only single-digit percentages, but most of those red ones are brand new and just getting into people's cars. And cars, of course, take a long time to cycle through. People in America, on average, keep their car for 8 years. So it takes a long time for the new items to move their way through the system. We asked people if you could only ever have one device in your car, and we did the same survey in 2003. If you could only have one device in your car, what would that one device be? And you see the AM/FM radio is still overwhelmingly the leader, 5 times bigger than second place at 51%, but down significantly from 71% 8 years ago. And the main other thing you see, again, is just how many different options now people have in their car and how much competition there is for options to spend your time and your attention on while you're driving in your car. Just so you know, in case anyone has any questions of interest, we're also tracking in all these studies, this was just a tiny fraction of what we're doing in these studies, social media, smartphones, tablets, online video, many, many other sectors. So if there's interest, I'll happily, and by the way, this data is all completely shared with the public. Any requests for crosstabs or subgroups, we make it entirely available, so there's nothing private about it. And so if anyone does have inquiries about any of these things, but I will say that what people often lose sight of in America is while the commercial broadcast industry is going through some real challenges right now, if you think of the totality of usage of radio, it really is sort of a golden age. The amount of total radio that people are using, if you add up all the things I was talking about, internet radio, satellite radio, even the tiny little bit of digital radio, et cetera, the total amount of radio is as big or bigger than ever. It's just changing and transitioning like anything does. And you see that it's coming from an exploding number of devices and platforms, as I mentioned. So, I always like to point this out, is that when I was a kid, we had this image of the future, and in the future, you would be flying around with a jetpack on your back, and that's how you would get to work. And then recently, I found that you actually can get a jetpack. There's a company called Martin Jetpack, and if you have $50,000 free dollars, you send it to them, and apparently they mail you your jetpack. And I guess there's no licensing or anything. You just put it on and fly away. And the point I always try to make with this is the future comes much faster than you think, and in many ways the future is now. I'm thrilled that you guys asked me to come here. Am I taking questions, or are we just... Yes, I'm taking questions. So thank you so much for asking me to come here, and I'll happily take any questions. We didn't track Spotify until this year, and I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but if you hand me your business card and write the word Spotify on it, because we just have it now for the first time, I'll get it to you. It just really came to America quite recently. But it's off to a pretty good start. I mean, they were very clever with their Facebook integration. And again, I have a college-age son, and that's where you really see it. I mean, it has caught on clearly with kids on college campuses. Yes, sir.
אתם מוזמנים לשאול בעברית, הוא יענה באנגלית, יש לו את התרגום.
Is there a change? Radio is booming. Is there a change in the content of the radio?
Well, that's always evolving, of course, in America and throughout the world, where new formats are being developed and new ideas are being tried. The expansion, what happens in the world of FM, FM is sort of from here to here. And typically, people are going for a very mass audience because that's the best way to monetize what you're doing. Satellite radio in the United States is offering options from here to here. Internet radio, my arms are not long enough to describe all the different things that you can find. And so if you're familiar with the term the long tail, that's what's really being filled in by these other options. So if I loved Jamaican reggae music, for instance, I can't get that on American radio. But now with internet radio or satellite radio, I can go find that. If I'm an opera fan, it's almost impossible to find on American commercial or even non-commercial FM radio but you can get that now. All those kinds of examples. So the change is that people can find their very specific desires in a way that they, were limited out of in a world where FM, 88 to 108 or whatever was all that was available to them.
Other than music?
What? Well, yes, those are developing all the time and very rapidly. I mean, mostly talk shows and come down to talent. Again, there'll be a discussion of UK radio later. There was this long-held belief that Brits were not interested in talk radio. And when I started working in Britain, and Clive can attest to this, I kept saying, that's not the case, that you just don't have good people talking on the radio. And over the last 10 years, there's been a huge increase in listenership to talk radio in Britain, and largely because they've found people who understand how to do it well and how to entertain and inform and do great talk radio. So the challenge of talk radio is typically not what people are talking about. It's typically who is the host or hostess and how do they perform.
זה יכול להגיע למקומות אחרים, במיוחד למקומות כמו שלנו, למזרח התיכון, למקומות מחוץ לאמריקה, ואם כן, כמה מהר, עד מתי בערך?
Well, I work very, very closely with the leadership of Pandora, and that is their number one opportunity that they're working very, very hard on. Is right now they're only available in the USA. They're not even in Canada. And they're working very, very hard on it. It's a matter of music rights fees, country by country, which are virtually all different in every country. And they've not been able to acquire a rights situation that allows their business model to work in any other country as of yet. But it is their absolute number one priority. And if someone here wants to be the person who brings Pandora to Israel, I can hook you up with their key guys if you find me and chat with me.
Thank you, please.
Thanks. What's Forward Sync?
Pardon me?
Forward Sync. You showed it before in the different opportunities of listening to radio in the car. So down to 1%. Forward Sync.
Yeah, that's an integration system in Ford cars that is like a complete entertainment system that's entirely voice activated. And so you can say, turn on this radio station. You can say, turn on my iPod and play a song by the Beatles. You can say, it's like Siri almost. It's a completely voice-activated, voice-integrated system. It's just getting going. But I will tell you something interesting about it. I went to a conference entirely on the topic of these car systems. And first of all, the car companies are dying to get these things into your cars because they see a way to make money. But more to the point, they showed the data. If I'm a young person buying my very first car, and there's two cars that are exactly equal in every way, but this one has that sync system, and this one, they'll buy the Ford every single time. And Ford has had a great year, especially with that younger target. Young people buying their very first car, they're crushing everyone because of this system. And so now everyone's copying it and trying to bring it. But young people want that in their cars very, very dearly.
Ken Baksha.
I just wanted to add that Pandora was originally open in Israel, and then it was cut off a couple of years ago, and a lot of us got hooked on it actually because of the system. I've always wondered what the incentive is to cut us off. I know that there are copyright agreements and whatnot, but it sounds to me kind of stupid to cut off a ready audience instead of finding ways of introducing them into a commercial venue that can bring in revenue.
I know they're dying to come back here and everywhere. They cut off everybody, not just you, if that makes you feel better. It's less than 3.5 years ago. I have lunch with the CEO of Pandora every summer, every August, because he's out in California, but he's from New Jersey, and he comes home to visit his family. We have lunch. In the summer of 2008, we had our annual lunch together, and he said, "Larry, we're within weeks. We're within weeks of going out of business. If we can't get a rights deal here in America that we can live with, we're done by September 15th. 3.5 years later, they've gone public. They've got $1 billion valuation. They completely dominate the American internet radio market, and they're poised to continue growing tremendously. So they had to do everything they could to stay alive for a long period of time. It's only very recently that they're shot through up to the moon. So be patient. That it's their number one priority as a business. I know this for an absolute fact. But it's just a matter of getting a rights deal that will allow them to make money eventually, not even initially, but eventually, country by country.
Okay, last question.
In the past few years in the U.S., there has been a major decrease in the number of independent radio stations, as opposed to major networks and other public radio. Can you see why this happened in the past few years? Why have they gone out of business?
They haven't really gone out of business. They've been acquired by these giant, gobbling machines of corporate radio. Basically, there were very strict limitations on how many radio stations any one company could own until 1996. President Clinton signed a change in the law that basically lifted all caps on ownership. And so a lot of these smaller companies, these were independent guys making a living, and Clear Channel or these other companies came along put a check in front of them that says, I want to buy your radio station for more than they ever imagined they would get for their radio station. So much as they liked being independent broadcasters, they were also business people, and they said, I'll take it. And so basically the industry got almost entirely consolidated by a relatively small number of owners, and that's why it changed.
What about college radio stations?
There are still thousands of college radio stations, and they are still often as creative and innovative as they always were. The hard part, the sad part, is that the number of jobs that the young people who've trained in college radio in America can get in radio, in traditional radio, if you will, have dropped very, very dramatically. So it no longer, sadly, is a pathway to a career in radio, although some of them are switching over into internet radio and other kinds of things. But the information gets out these days, and there's fewer and fewer kids who want to go work at the college radio station because they don't see it. The only ones who do it are the ones who just truly, truly love radio and want to do it for its own sake, because fewer and fewer of them expect that they'll see a career out of it at the end, which is a real sad state of affairs.
Right. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Rosin, thank you for coming.